Is democracy dead beyond recall? Has the definition of democracy changed for all of us? Have we taken the words of Abraham Lincoln, do you remember it? Of the people, by the people, and for the people, and changed it to turn off the people, buy off the people, and fire the people. Think about it. Now, what I'd like to give you is an overview of global trends. We'll use certain terms. The term backsliders refers to democracies which are becoming less and less democratic. Striders means the countries where democracy is really improving. Did you realize that 70% of the world's population lives in countries that are either non-democratic or are democratically backsliding? Statistics show only 9% of the world's population live in high-performing democracies. More countries are moving into an authoritarian state rather than in a democratic direction. Since 2016, the number of countries moving towards authoritarianism are 3 times more than those moving towards democracy. Challenges faced by democratization. In 2021, the US military left Afghanistan and the Taliban quickly took over. They ousted and elected leadership. Now the Taliban's newly announced government is all male, which, as you know, is a recipe for disaster. It includes many individuals accused of terrorist activities over the last 2 decades. Take Mali in Western Africa. It held challenged election in 2021. Because of jihadist insurgencies, parts of Mali were barred from voting. The key opposition leader, Soumaila Cisse, was kidnapped a few days before election day. Between 2020 and 2021, 2 coups weakened any prospect of democratization or free election. Now let's look at some democratic backsliders. High on the list by 2020, Brazil was the democracy with the largest number of declining democratic attributes. Corruption scandals and protests have plagued the pandemic management of the nation. President Jair Bolsonaro consistently downplayed the pandemic. He's given mixed messages. He constantly attacked the media and openly defying democratic institutions. He accuses the magistrates of the judiciary of the Superior Electoral Court of preparing to conduct fraudulent activities over the 2022 elections. Brazil's Supreme Federal Court is investigating Bolsonaro for spreading false news about the electoral system. In response, what do you think he said? The president has openly declared that he will disobey the Supreme Federal Court's ruling. So much for Brazil. Now let's look at democratic striders. They are those who uphold democratic values. A good example is Zambia. It held free and fair elections in 2021. Opposition leader Hakainde Hichilema defeated incumbent President Edgar Lungu by a wide margin. This opened up Zambia for democratic regime change. There was a peaceful transfer of power for the 3rd time in Zambian history. Well, what about the most famous country in the world, Malaysia? Malaysia has had its fair share of both being a backslider and has been accused or has been praised as a strider. 5 examples of Malaysia democratically backsliding are: number 1, the government fiddling with election processes for a very long time. Number 2, messing with electoral boundaries to ensure that incumbent party wins even with the lower number of votes. Number 3, using backdoor governments when elected MPs betrayed a majority of the electorate. Number 4, scheduling only a one-day sitting of Parliament on the 18th of May 2021 without debate. Number 5, the government's attempt to impose emergency rule on the pretext of the COVID-19 pandemic when it didn't have majority. That was a clearest admission that the government had no majority. Now look at 6 examples of Malaysia striding. After 6 decades in power, a party called Barisan Nasional fell in the 2018 Malaysian tsunami. Number 2, the emergence of new political parties, or MUDA, the Malaysian Democratic Alliance, introduced youth activism in electoral politics. Number 3, the lowering of the minimum age for voting to 18 years. Burse, or Coalition for Clean and Fair Election, began electoral reforms as its agenda. 15 years later, it's given more Malaysians greater courage to speak up against political wrongdoings. Number 7, the conviction of ex-Prime Minister Najib being upheld in the Court of Appeal is seen as a welcome change. The troubling question, however, is if the former Prime Minister's conviction will be reversed or if he will be forgiven for political reasons. And second, will that conviction drive Malaysian politicians to be more honest? We must wait and see. At the global level, let us look at the opportunities for renewal in certain countries which are considered striders. Take Sweden, for example. Democracy there is a key feature of the education system itself. Their curriculum includes lessons on the theory and practice of democracy. Representatives of political parties visit schools. This helps students to learn about their political system and the differences between political parties. During the pandemic, civil disobedience and protests have grown in many countries, as you saw. For example, in Belarus, in Cuba, in Eswatini, or what was formerly known as Swaziland, Hong Kong, Myanmar, and even our neighbor Thailand. 82% of the countries, or 135 of them, experienced protests during the pandemic. What is now called the Asian Milk Tea Alliance is an online multinational solidarity movement for democracy. That movement shared protest tactics among democracy activists across different countries. For example, India, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Thailand. It's a powerful example of the strength of democratic aspirations among people, particularly youth, all across Asia. Which brings us to this question. Is there any hope left for democracy in the world? Dr. S.Y. Qureshi is the former election commissioner of India. He knows all about election cheating. He's quite sure. He says that democracy's resilience will ultimately triumph. Again, a gentleman by the name of Kevin Casas Zamora, the Secretary General of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, or abbreviated IDEA, explains why defending democracy matters. It's about protecting the dignity of human beings, he argues. Democracy does that better, he says, than any other political arrangement. Are these mere platitudes, or are there real life examples? Let's look at 3. In Afghanistan, a group of women refused to be cowed by fanatics. Second, in Myanmar, brave young pro-democracy activists to this day stand up for democracy. Which brings us to Cuba. Fearless dissidents speak out loud what the rest of Cuban society only whispers. Now, each of these acts of defiance is a triumph of the human spirit. However, and this is crucial, democracy's survival and its health requires your personal commitment. If you want to have something, you need to go and get it yourself, personally, peacefully, and within the law. Will you act to uphold democracy? Will you have the moral courage to demand that your leaders become striders instead of backsliders that they are? Will you do it? Or do you expect your neighbor to, while you sit at the side and become an armchair critic, while so-called leaders trade away your freedom and your rights and that of your grandchildren for their personal benefit? That is the transformative question, isn't it? Thank you, and I'll see you again. Goodbye.